Hi, welcome everyone to this interview with Professor Arvind Rajagopal. He teaches in the departments of Media, Culture and Communication, Sociology, and Social and Cultural Analysis at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development in New York University. Two of his most popular books include Politics After Television, Hindu Nationalism and the Reshaping of the Public in India, published by Cambridge in 2001, and The Indian Public Sphere, Structure and Transformation, published by Oxford in 2009. We welcome you, sir, to this interview. Thank you for giving us time.
Thank you both for having me on your show, and delighted to be in this conversation.
Right. So, sir, let's begin with a question on, communication, because you've dealt with it extensively in your work. And somewhere it has been also theorized that the 20th century saw an intensely mediated period of history. Actually, it's still continuing with technologies of communication being used at an unprecedented level. But we do not yet have a history of communication that clarifies the nature of that influence. And the concept has, in fact, been often treated philosophically rather than historically and subject to contextual analysis, of course. So how do you then seek to understand and explore the shifting meanings of communication as a value?
Yeah, very important question. And I think a lot of work needs to be done about it. I'm not pretending to have the last word on it. There's a lot to say. One can approach it in terms of the question concerning technology, which philosophers like Heidegger and Georges Canguilhem have written about. And now the relationship between human beings and technology in the process of evolution is something that is now being rethought by philosophers, so that technology is not something external to human beings, the evolutionary process of human beings. Rather, technology and human beings have co-evolved. That's the way in which it is being thought about. André Leroy Gourhan, Bernard Stiegler, and others, that we cannot understand human beings independent of external tools which they utilize to survive, to actually define themselves as human. That is the distinguishing feature of the human species, as opposed to other animals which can survive by themselves. They have, defense mechanisms, and human beings don't have, they rely on other things external to their physical carapace, so to say. Now, it seems to me that the question of media it has become a focal point for understanding the problem of technology, because media, communication, they have become far more intimate and far more pervasive. The spread has been much more extensive than any other technology. So in a way, the question of media highlights the larger problem of technology and the omission of technology in understanding, human evolution. And it's also a missing space in philosophy, actually. Yeah, it's a question that has tended to be bypassed. One way in which we can understand that bypassing in philosophy is the sort of Platonic emphasis on ideas. Yeah, so there has been a tendency to think about phenomena as reflections of ideas, where the ideas are the most true aspect of what is out there in the world. And that reversal of Platonism has been going on since Nietzsche, at least in the 19th century. Yeah, that you don't begin with the ideas, you begin with the sensations, you begin with the observable, with the phenomenological world. Yeah, so media actually it's peculiar because they are the most trivialized and disparaged concepts, you can say, in the traditional humanities. If you do media, then Okay, fine. I know everything I need to know about you. Let me talk to somebody else. That is the, a frequent response that it's not vested with the kind of gravitas in academic inquiry that many other subjects are, say class or race or gender, or sexuality. Media is something free floating and not so serious. Now, what my research discovered by looking at the Social Science Research Council archive, American archives, a range of American archives, basically, is that this trivialization of media was not accidental. It was not accidental. It was actually part of a post-World War II American emphasis, supported by military funding, supported by government funding, to reassure the public that media were not technologies to be worried about, that they could only do good, that they were going to promote American democracy or confirm the existence of American democracy. Yeah, so this was a unique discipline that began its life not by announcing what was unique to it and what was innovative about it. On the contrary, communication studies began its journey in the post-World War II period by saying everything is all right, communication is old, there's nothing new about communication, it has been going on since the Stone Age, and actually underplaying the question of technology, whose increased presence should have been at the center of their attention. Yeah. Instead of that, they sought to allay, to reassure, and to placate, and to criticize earlier scholarship, usually represented by the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School were, extreme Marxists. What do you expect of Marxists? They get everything wrong. They were exaggerating the power of media. We are here to tell you, don't worry. So this was the approach of, I know it sounds like a caricature, but actually, this is a fairly faithful summary account of how the discipline behaved. Yeah. Now, this was an American discipline. That's crucial to note. Communication studies began as an American discipline, and it was 2 to 3 decades ahead of the rest of the world, because nobody had, even those institutions which sought to begin media studies outside in other countries, it was really a long time before it acquired any momentum at all. Yeah. Now, what's interesting here is that communication was essentially two-tone. There was one story for domestic consumption and one story for foreign consumption. So domestically, the Americans said, we are already a democracy. Nothing can go wrong for us. And communication affirms our democratic society. But abroad, it was all about strong effects and rapid modernization. And so they were making, for the same scholars about the same technology at the same time, were making different arguments for domestic effects and for effects in so-called developing countries. And because the scholarship has been so overwhelmingly American, few people, I don't see anyone who actually noticed the discrepancy, that they were saying different things to different audiences. Yeah, so for countries like India, they were promoting communication quite aggressively. And here, what is interesting is that they reassured governments that using advertisements as the source of commercial revenue, because the whole problem with mass media was, who is going to support it? Where do we have the money for it? And every country said, we don't have the money. And here the Americans would come and say, don't worry. Don't worry. You can use advertisements and it will not affect your hold on power. Believe it or not. They were quite, they had a strong sense of realpolitik, advising governments that they could consolidate their hold on power, that challengers to their power would not be able to register themselves in public mind because of this, the power of mass media to impress itself on the public in general. And advertisements were a harmless method to fund mass media, because what does it matter what toothbrush you use? These are small decisions and it's not going to affect anything large. Now, what is interesting, Rituparna and Deepali, is I had a conversation with the Information Broadcasting Secretary, S.S. Gill, in the late 1980s. This is the gentleman who has written an op-ed about it, that commercialization of the television was initiated by him. That is to say, on a substantial scale. The decision to broadcast the Hindu epics was taken by him. Yeah, and he said, what is the problem in having commercial supported television? It is like deciding what toothbrush to use. He used this example. 20 years later, I found the American article, the social science article written in the 1950s, that was based on the same example, toothbrush, what toothbrush you use. Okay. Now, the example stuck in my mind because, as you and I know, most Indians do not use toothbrushes. We use twigs or we use our fingers. We don't use toothbrushes. So it was an American example, and the American experts had been coming to India and advising the government. The Indian Institute of Mass Communication was started with a grant from the Ford Foundation. The American agencies were extremely interested in promoting communication in India. Yeah, so one is seeing different pieces of the puzzle falling together. Yeah, that media need to be promoted. Commercials sponsored broadcasting is harmless and will, ensure that the existing system, whatever it is, they were not worried, would stay in power. And the scholarship as well was designed to reassure, and criticism was tended generally to be marginalized. Yeah, that was true there. It was also true here. So here, in India, people would speak about intellectual dumping. Yeah, they saw the communication avalanche that suddenly sort of descended as intellectual dumping from the West. Yeah, and so the established scholars, and we had many distinguished scholars in philosophy, history, economics, etc., they did not want to get involved with communication. See, it was beneath them. Homo hierarchicus came to the rescue, so to say, but it was not to the rescue of, Indian development, but rather about, you could say, Indian prestige. Yeah. So, so the question of communication is wrapped up in Cold War politics. And what is interesting is that, communication has the same word root as communism. Yeah, they both have the Latin word communis, in common, sharing, mutuality. Yeah, this overlap is not without interest for our purposes, for your question. Yeah, because it was because of the hysteria around communism in the post-World War II period that the Americans decided, we don't have an answer to the communist ideology because, our capitalist ideology is, it's patchwork. We decide every, so often what to do. We don't have a theory of history. We basically believe, God is on our side. Yeah, those guys have a philosophy of history. The intellectuals will go for communism if given choice. What do we do about it? So communication became the answer to communism. Yeah, the intensive promotion of media, promotion of the wealth and pleasures of commodity culture, where the Americans were excelling. Yeah. So that, in a very short way, Rituparna, is the answer to the question that communication was politicized, it was unexamined, and it came to be supported by a massive onslaught that reflected the expansionist impulse and ambition of the American post-war empire. Yeah, and we are sort of having to figure out the problems, the theoretical problems in the midst of these sort of political, economic, and cultural challenges. And that is not, that's, it's been against the odds to make an advance in that context. Yeah. So that's just by way of beginning the response to your question. Yeah. And now let me say a little bit more here. So historically, communication, if you look at, say, the Government of India budgets, where does communication get located? Communication was not an independent category. Communication was grouped together with transportation. Yeah, roads, railways, canals, telegraph also was included. And then over time, these separated and communication became its own entity. Yeah. Now, what that meant was communication was always a state operation. Communication was a state apparatus. Yeah, and this was reflected, for example, in the philosopher Louis Althusser, who in 1969 wrote his famous essay, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses. Amongst the ideological state apparatuses, he includes media. Yeah. So that is how media were traditionally classified, even in the modern era, that it was, an attached agency of the government. What the Americans did was to say that media are technologies of freedom. Yeah, so they were very concerned to detach media from state control and to make it into an appurtenance of individual consumption, individual self-fashioning, and oriented towards the market rather than towards the state. And that shift from state apparatus to technologies of freedom was something that happened across the, you can say, 70s, 80s, and 90s. That's a, intricate and complicated story. But the short lesson is that during the Cold War, the media were massively promoted as for ideological purposes by the Americans. Yeah, in the terms that I've outlined to you. It is after the Cold War ended that the expansion of media and the impact of media has been most dramatic. Yeah, so because that was when we had the period of market reforms. That was the period when the governments themselves sort of stepped back and decided that they could not commit their resources to welfare and development to the extent that they had been doing. And of course, there was a kind of technological boom with the internet and social media, where the pervasive spread of communication technologies at the micro level has been, as you know, that's your subject, unprecedented and utterly transformative. And what's interesting is at every step of the way, there were promises made for the miraculous positive effects of communication technology. At every step of the way, there were never any results published. Acha, us waqt kya hua? What results did the effects actually materialize as promised? Never, not once. Instead, the bar kept moving. New technology, new situation, more technology, etc. Yeah, so a fascinating example of faith-based development, faith-based expansion in the name of science and technology. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for putting it out there. And you've discussed, you've sort of answered the historical background of communication, but you speak about the transformation after the Cold War, and we see something which is happening with the media now. And people like you and then Professor Maitri Chaudhary have spoken about the refashioning of the media. So, how do you see the now the media actually respond to this crisis, and do they try to investigate the links between mediation and political imagination? So if you could talk about it, particularly talking about India.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Rituparna. And I would have to say that it is very challenging because I would say we have an ideological crisis or a level of confusion, because where do you turn? What are the ideologies that are still left, that appear to be valid? Who are the authorities to whom you turn? The government is, retreating from its commitments to, welfare and development. The market is supposed to sort of take up the burden, but the market is shown to be, not interested. Yeah. So it's what we see in the media is that the liberal opinion has tended to look to the state for answers, and also to the civil sector, civil society, NGOs. If you recall, after the emergency, there was a huge explosion of the NGO presence in civil society, and a very strong argument made by many academics, including Rajni Kothari and so forth, that really we are over-relying on the state, and we have to turn to civil society and small-scale NGO organizations to address developmental challenges. Yeah, that had been the approach. But today we find that other than the RSS, civil society organizations are really being given their expiration notice. I mean, they're not able to get funds. Arbitrary charges are being sort of placed against people with complete disregard for propriety, evidence, etc. So it's a crisis in the sense of where do you turn? What are the sources of hope? And here, what's interesting also is the international connection. Yeah, that the United States and G7 countries broadly have looked from the time of Indian independence really very charitably upon India as a country which is trying to make a go of bringing capitalism and democracy together. So India was supposed to be a poster child for the success of capitalism in the global south. Yeah, and of course, a contrast to China. Now, what's ironic is that China today is, soon going to be the most powerful economy in the world. They are still formally communist, but in practice capitalist. They are the poster child for capitalism success, but under a communist label, so nobody wants to say that. Well, as for India, well, you and I know what the situation is. It's no poster child. Nevertheless, there is still a very, for instance, the United States, Indians are in powerful places all over the country, government and the economy, etc. People don't want to criticize India. This is something that you can observe in the press. You can talk about the China virus, but you will never call the Delta variant the Indian virus. Yeah, so the temptation is to go easy on India because poor things, they're trying their best. They're democratic. They're, allowing the free market to be free. So we have to support India. So this international alignment also complicates the process of actually discussing what are the problems and how they can be addressed for the Indian context. Yeah.
Right. So, sir, you've worked on the vernacular press, and you've looked at how the role of the vernacular press, the television, as well as the internet has worked in the development of the public sphere in India. So my question to you would be that, how do you see their role changing in the contemporary times?
Right, right. Well, at the time I did my study, there was a huge gulf between the English press and the vernacular press. Sections of the vernacular press were always publishing reports that were outrageous and at variance from the truth in very dramatic ways, but often no action was taken. And the government had a policy of supporting the small newspapers, which often, meant supporting their own cronies and so forth. There was all of that going on. Yeah. Now, what's interesting, and this has happened in the wake of television, is that it is the English press that has become vernacularized. Yeah, the English press has taken on characteristics of, you could say, for example, the Hindi press. They have, made myth and scandal sort of governing idioms of their reportage. They're much more comfortable, navigating the realm of rumor as if there was no outside to it. They publish stories which are false and don't necessarily retract them. So here the weight of numbers has been crucial, because the vernacular audiences are, of course, far bigger. There was a confidence on the part of the English media that we are the future, so we don't have to look outside. We are ourselves the future. But if they had looked outside, they would have seen that, no, the future was outside them. It was the vernacular media. Yeah, so that would be one very, again, abbreviated way to respond to the question. But there was a market pressure. There was a pressure of market demographics where the vernacular culture was, in a sense, more powerful. And we cannot omit here, of course, the crucial role of ideology and political change, which we know about and don't have to elaborate, I think, for this audience. Yeah.
Since we're talking about media and the television, I think something which has become extremely popular now, and one cannot, not see them, are these campaigns, election campaigns on the television. And, we see how the role of the television has, in election campaigns, has increased, I'd say. So is there a visibility trap there?
Right. Yeah, well, that's a good question. I'm not, the visibility trap was noticeable with the Anna Hazare campaign. That's when it sort of became noticed. Now, you may know that, every year in India, the entertainment media publish an annual report. It can come from KPMG, it can come from FICCI, it can come from one or other of these large consulting advertising agencies. If you look on the web, you'll see the media and entertainment annual report for this year, that year, and so on. Every year they publish, and it'll come from different sources. And one of these reports, right after the Anna Hazare mobilization, I saw in the annual report that the media were boasting about the success of the Anna Hazare campaign. They were boasting about it, right? Now, many of the people who participated in that campaign would have thought that they were being they were protesting the regime, protesting the powers that be, and here were the powers that be that actually were taking credit for the campaign. And the reason was not hard to find. They laid out the logic fairly explicitly in the report that we can increase the media audience through protest rather than through consumption. Because people don't have money to consume, at least they can protest. Protest is free, just like speech is free. So the media under the UPA government, should be noted, under the UPA government, and we know that the Anna Hazare campaign was, pushed and promoted by the RSS. They chose to demonstrate the power of media. And this was done right on the heels of the Arab Spring. So, sorry. This was done right on the heels of the Arab Spring. So it was as if the global media said, we've seen what we can do in the Middle East. Why not India? Why not India? And of course, our own Indian patriots wanted to show the rest of the world that India too is democratic. In fact, much more democratic than other countries. Yeah, so the Delhi rape case, the Anna Hazare campaign, these were very prominently supported by the media. This was the first time the media supported popular protest on anything like this scale. The historic approach of the media was to say they are not breaking the law or they are breaking the law. That was the extent of their interest. Is there violence? Is there not violence? And they always adopted a pro-state attitude in the past towards any protest. That is implicitly against the protesters. So the Anna Hazare campaign was a watershed when the media decided they will actually take a different stance. And this was led by the Times of India group, Bennett and Coleman. Yeah, and I've spoken to the general manager at the time, Sunil Lulla, who was gracious enough to confirm that yes, Times of India did push the Anna Hazare campaign, and we are very thank you for your congratulations. That was what he said. Yeah. So, so that process of visibility being a trap, where you think you're doing something which is free and spontaneous, but there's a larger script in which you're already playing, the role that you're playing is already decided and determined. Yeah, that is the visibility trap. That is very much continuing today, I suppose, in general. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that there are not many surprises and many challenges to a model of control with social media being what it is. That's I mean, here now I should ask you to elaborate because you're much more the experts on this than I am. But that's a sort of broad contour of how I would respond. Yeah.
We're not experts, but we also see the visibility trap very much now in social media. And so the last question, actually, we want to know that, how the public has been shaped and then reshaped in something that you call on the lines of politics after television. I mean, what's been going on now with the entry of the digital platforms?
Yes, right. Well, we know that with the digital platforms, it is possible to nudge and steer behavior with micro cues, so to say, that make suggestions and increase the acceptability of one rather than another kind of choice. And we also know that although the social media feels so intimate and so personal, or they may feel that way, in fact, one is entering into a massive system of elaborate control, yeah, where you have to worry about every casual remark that you might make. You could lose your job, you could lose your friends, that level of policing has, we still have difficulty grasping in our minds the scale and rapidity of this transformation, yeah, where it's as if we are all in a Soviet commune, so to say, and every move of ours is being examined by all of our Soviet neighbors. This is not the, free speech sphere that we thought we were building. Yeah, so that is very much correct. And here, of course, in the Indian context, we have a government that is also not interested necessarily in furthering sort of broad popular democratic energies, but is more intent on sort of ensuring it stays in power and so forth. So it seems to me that here regulation is critical, yeah, because the Cold War model for promoting media was free market, yeah, and it came together with an idea that there should be the free flow of information, that the free flow of information was sure to promote democracy. And we know, we have again enough experience, 60 years, that when information is allowed to flow freely, the most powerful become more powerful yet, and the less powerful have less power than they used to. Yeah. So without regulations that limit this increase in inequality, which is happening through the media, I don't think we can actually mount a challenge to the kind of visibility trap problems that you've mentioned.
Right. Thank you, sir. Thank you for taking time out today and talking to us, doing sociology.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for the wonderful questions.
Thank you so much. And to our